morning to you, Professor Konstan.
Good morning.
It's good evening here to our guests.
I know.
Yeah. I would like to welcome you all here in our new lecture. And I would like to welcome Professor David Konstan, who is thankfully accepted our invitation to give a lecture today. We are very grateful to him. Professor Konstan is a classic professor at the Department of Classics, New York University, and emeritus professor at Classics Department in Brown University. He has many books. His latest is in 2014, entitled Beauty, the Fortune of an Ancient Greek Idea. Professor Konstan won several awards and was elected as an honorary fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities in 2012. Today, Professor Konstan will explain how the divine kingship in Alexandria may have influenced the self-conception of Roman emperors. Welcome again, Professor Konstan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amalia. Thank you for the invitation to speak. For me, it is a return to Egypt because I lived in Cairo for 2 years. I have studied Arabic, although I don't speak it well. I love the country and hope to come back soon. I would only say that one thing I'm very proud of is that a book I wrote on friendship in the ancient world now appears in Arabic. And one can read it, and it is a lovely translation published by the Cultural Foundation of Abu Dhabi. The talk that I'm giving today, and I hope everyone can hear me clearly, the talk is on when citizens become gods, from Alexandria to Rome. In 1925, the American writer F. Scott Fitzgerald began a short story called Rich Boy with these words: "Let me tell you about the very rich. They are different from you and me. They possess and enjoy early, and it does something to them. Even when they enter deep into our world or sink below us, they still think they are better than we. They are different." 11 years later, in 1936, Ernest Hemingway published a story called The Snows of Kilimanjaro, in which a character recalled Fitzgerald's remark about how the very rich are different, and he said, yes, they have more money. But this really misses the point of Fitzgerald's observation, and Fitzgerald was quite irritated when he read Hemingway's story. For the rich often do come to think of themselves as superior, even if they profess ideals of equality. And this is even more true for those who are born into moneyed families. But if this is the case for the very wealthy, imagine the attitude of kings and emperors who enjoy near absolute power in addition to limitless economic resources. And if we add to this the idea that kings are actually divine, gods in their own right, it is easy to see that a chasm will divide the self-conception of such rulers from that of ordinary people. Now, Fitzgerald ascribed the different self-consciousness of the rich to their early sense of entitlement. They do not have to struggle, but have everything they need or want, as though by right. So too for those who are born to the purple, to be sure, yet many had fought to rise to the summit of power, and presumably these people had to acquire, in the course of rulership, their sense of a special place in the world. This will have been even more the case when the conception of the ruler was itself undergoing change, in periods of transition, for example, from republican government to monarchy, or when the rule of a given state passed by way of conquest from the native population and its traditions to a foreign domination, where the norms of sovereignty may have been different, and so inaugurated a period of mutual adjustment and assimilation. Such situations call for the creative construction of a new kind of identity, which is figured or prefigured in art and literature, and emerges in part through deliberate propaganda, and in part, maybe more significantly, through unplanned opportunities and circumstances which subtly change perception, whether of others or of the monarchs themselves. This process was particularly pronounced in ancient Alexandria, where Greek rulers inherited, after the conquests of Alexander the Great, a status as pharaohs to which their previous experience had not prepared them, though there were doubtless elements of such a tradition already in Macedon, and even, as we shall see, in Athens itself, famous for its democracy. Later, there was a similar development in Rome, where the transition from republic to empire led to something very like a divine right monarchy. In this talk, I will consider some of the ways in which human beings, Greeks and Romans, came to regard themselves and to be regarded as more than human. And at the center of my story will be Alexandria. We tend to think of ancient Greece as the cradle of democracy, and indeed there were cities that insisted on the idea of equality among citizens, that is, free adult males with political rights. We will leave out of the picture for now the facts of slavery and the unequal treatment of women and resident aliens. And there is some truth to the idea that the Greek tradition in the classical period was reluctant to confer divine honors on mortals. Roger Brock writes in his recent book, Greek Political Imagery from Homer to Aristotle, he says, "It is rare for Greek rulers to be straightforwardly characterized as divine." But Brock then adds, by the end of the 5th century, however, we can detect a change in the fortunes of the image which reflects the rising stock of monarchy. And by the end of the 4th century, a new attitude was palpable. A well-known instance is the famous hymn composed by a certain Hermocles, which the Athenians sang to Demetrius Poliorcetes upon his triumphant approach to the city, after he had driven out the pro-Macedonian Demetrius of Phalerum. Now, according to Athenaeus, this is the description of this hymn that the Athenians sang when Demetrius the Conqueror approached the city. The Athenians received Demetrius not only with frankincense and crowns and libations of wine, but they even went out to meet him with hymns and choruses and dancing and singing. And they stood in front of him in multitudes, dancing and singing, and saying that he was the only true God, and that all the rest of the gods were either asleep or gone away to a distance, or were no gods at all. And they fell at his feet and addressed supplications and prayers to him. This mortal was the only God. And here are the Athenians, whose cities had been the very model of democracy, bowing before a foreign ruler and worshiping him not only as a god, but as more powerful and deserving of prayer than the traditional gods themselves. Alexander the Great was already regarded as pharaoh when he conquered Egypt, and he clearly sought and enjoyed divine status. But it was only after his death that his chief officer, Ptolemy, and Ptolemy's descendants established themselves as rulers over Egypt and made Alexandria, the city founded by Alexander, their capital. Alexandria was certainly a multicultural city with a huge population that included native Egyptians, a large number of Jews, and of course a great many Greek settlers, many of them probably mercenary soldiers who chose to settle in the newly established metropolis. Since the overlords of Egypt were Greek, Alexandria itself took on the quality of a Greek city, organized on Greek principles. It was under the Ptolemies, we recall, that the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, as a way, at least in part, of bringing the Jewish population into a closer relationship with the surrounding culture. Now, the first Ptolemy also received divine honors, of course. How did this military man, a member of Alexander's military entourage, but still an ordinary mortal, assume the status associated with the traditional kings of Egypt? How was the transformation in his identity achieved? How did he become a divine pharaoh? Now, no doubt, sheer power, combined with massive propaganda, was effective. But art, too, has a role to play, and a fundamental one. And by art, I mean not only the visual, but also the literary arts. But art is a subtle medium and may contain more than one message. So even as poetry and sculpture may have elevated fellow mortals to the status of gods, they were also capable of exercising a certain restraining influence on the new rulers. A poet or artist might manipulate traditional motifs as a way both to honor rulers as divine and also, in the words of John Ma, this is a scholar who recently wrote a book called Statues and Cities, published just last year, he said it also works to constrain elites within communitarian norms. What he means is make sure that the elites do not get wholly out of bounds and distance themselves too far from the customs of their fellow human beings. Well, let's take a look at two examples of such efforts in the context of the first generations of the Ptolemies in Egypt. Callimachus was a famous poet, and perhaps even more famous for his work in the great Alexandrian library where we are meeting today, where he was responsible for preparing the catalog of the many thousands and tens of thousands of papyrus rolls that filled the shelves. Papyrus rolls were, of course, the precursor to the codex, which is to say books with bound pages such as we use today, and which are now giving way in their turn to online publication. Among the poems that survive in manuscript of Callimachus is a collection of 6 hymns composed to 6 different Greek deities. I want to look in particular at the 5th and 6th hymns, addressed to Athena and Demeter, to illustrate how a poet might achieve this double effect that I just mentioned. In his hymn to Demeter, Callimachus self-consciously distances himself from the theme of the Homeric hymn to this goddess. Homer had related how Zeus had betrothed Persephone, his daughter and Demeter's daughter, to his brother Hades, that is the god of the underworld, without consulting the mother, that is Demeter, who regarded this arrangement as an abduction. So Zeus betroths his daughter to the god of the underworld, that's Zeus' brother, but he doesn't consult the mother, and she was upset at this. So angered by this insult and the loss of her daughter, Demeter abandoned Olympus and dwelled on earth disguised as an old woman. She took a job as a nurse to the infant son of a prominent family in Eleusis. But when the mother interrupted Demeter as she was roasting the baby in the fire with the intention of making him immortal, Demeter was enraged and afflicted the world with a famine. She was the goddess of grain, simultaneously depriving the gods of sacrifices. Zeus is finally induced to negotiate a compromise, whereby Persephone will spend 4 months each year in Hades, in the underworld, and the other 8 months with her mama on Mount Olympus. Now, an odd aspect of this tale is that Demeter, when she settles accounts with Zeus, she achieves this in an indirect fashion. After all, she's angry at Zeus, but the way she gets her revenge is by punishing human beings for an accidental offense on the part of one woman. One woman came in while she was roasting the baby in the fire. She got angry, and she afflicted the entire world with a famine. Now, there are reasons for this, but we don't have to think about them here. Callimachus very clearly had this hymn by Homer in mind when he wrote his own hymn to the goddess, for he explicitly says that he will not discuss the story of how she searched for her daughter, during which time she did not eat or drink or wash, because he refuses to touch on topics that brought tears to Demeter. Callimachus prefers, he says, to treat three more noble points. One, how Demeter bestowed laws on cities, and two, how she taught the art of agriculture, and finally, how she punished Erysichthon as a warning against transgression. And this is what two-thirds of the poem is about. Now, Erysichthon was the son of a Thessalian king, and he conceived the plan to cut down an ancient grove of trees that were sacred to Demeter. And to do this, he collects a band of 20 brawny, tough henchmen to assist him. Demeter hears a cry of pain, and she takes on the form of her priestess in order to dissuade this evil and shameless fellow from carrying out his design, cutting down the sacred trees. When he pays no attention, Demeter then assumes her own proper form, just as she did in the Homeric poem, but here she punishes only Erysichthon. Doesn't even punish his helpers because they were forced to submit to their lord's wishes. She afflicts Erysichthon with a never-ending hunger, and in the end, when he has eaten his parents out of all their possessions, he is reduced to sitting in the streets begging for scraps of food. So unlike Homer's goddess, Callimachus's Demeter is careful to punish only the actual offender and give him fair warning in advance. She also selects a punishment that precisely fits the crime. Since Erysichthon had planned to build a roof over the feasting hall with the trees that he cut down, she afflicts him with perpetual hunger so that he may feast plentifully. In the end, at the end of the poem, Callimachus hails Demeter and prays that she will preserve the city in harmony, providing rich harvests and peace. Now, at one time, I thought of this poem as celebrating civic life, and that's surely part of its message. This is a civilized version of Demeter. She is there to protect the laws. She is there to provide a bountiful harvest. That all is true. But it now seems to me that it also has to do with kingship. The central episode involves a prince who trespasses on a sacred place with the intention of exploiting it for his own private purposes. A royal youth is given a lesson in respect for the divine. He is not entitled to subordinate the sacred to his carnal appetites. This by itself might be construed as a message to Egypt's rulers, even if the scene is set in Thessaly. Do not overstep the limits between the human and the divine. But there is also something more, I think. Demeter, too, has been chastened, so to speak. She is no longer the willful goddess of the Homeric hymn, but a fair-minded judge, careful to discriminate between the guilty and the innocent, and taking into account not only actions, but intentions, and even the natural submission to authority, as in the case of Erysichthon's gang of thugs she doesn't punish. Might there be a lesson here for the Ptolemies on how gods ought to comport themselves? Their duty is to secure good crops and promote concord, and this is achieved by the respectful treatment